Good evening, and welcome to the 2013 Walter Judd Award ceremony. This is our 19th year bestowing this award on worthy individuals who advance the cause of freedom around the world. Tonight we have the privilege of honoring Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, former Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs. This award has a great history and an impressive list of previous recipients, 3 of whom we are lucky enough to have with us here tonight. The 2007 award winner, General Edward Rowney. The 2010 award winner, Suzanne Schultz. And the 2012 award winner, Ambassador Otto Wright. In addition, we are here to celebrate the students attending the 2013 Angelichev Institute on Comparative Political and Economic Systems and the Institute on Economics and International Affairs. Before we begin the award presentation, I'd like to give you a snapshot of what it's like to be a student in our summer programs. These students hail from 106 colleges and universities with over 37 different majors. They represent 35 states here in the United States, as well as 17 countries from around the world. As many of you know, an integral part of the TFAS experience is the internship component. Students in ICPIS and IIA intern 30 to 35 hours a week for various public policy organizations, embassies, federal agencies, and nonprofit organizations throughout the DC metropolitan area. We'd like to thank our internship sites for providing a positive learning environment and for giving our students continued guidance and support during the program. So please join me in a round of applause for our internship supervisors, several of whom are with us tonight. I would also like to recognize the faculty. Our professors spend countless hours preparing for classes, teaching lectures, and providing one-on-one mentoring for each of our students. Tonight, we're joined by Professor Gary Armstrong, Karen Sarnecki, and Tom Kranowitter. So if you could please help me give them and the other Institute professors well-deserved recognition for their integral part in the program. And in the students' limited free time, very brief, students attend briefings and special events around the DC area. To name a few events, students this summer will attend an event on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, the State Department, the World Bank, the Federal Reserve, the IMF, and the CIA, as well as participate in special guest lectures on topics such as immigration in the United States, building Africa up from within, the economics behind capitalism, and key issues in U.S. foreign policy. They also have the opportunity to attend small group networking events led by professionals working in the international community, federal agencies, congressional offices, and the financial sector. I'd now like to invite to the podium Davis Tutt, a student in the Angelichev Institute, to give a short testimonial about his summer experience. Davis is a rising junior at Colorado College, where he studies art history and political science. He is interning this summer with Kansas Senator Pat Roberts. Welcome, Davis.
There we go. A little taller, I guess. Thank you, Lily, for the opportunity to speak tonight. So just to start off, I skillfully wind my way through crowds of aimless tourists who are focused on the words of their veteran tour guide, each hoping not to miss any bit of captivating Capitol history. Gaining elevation, I scale a historic marble flight, eagerly awaiting the magnificent space at its peak. Immediately, light beams into the setting, filling the rotunda with the warm glow of a summer's afternoon. This is my place of work, a place filled with the great wonders of Bermude, Bierstadt, and Trumbull. The Capitol building is an artistic masterpiece. It's dedicated to the foundation and the greatness of the American nation. As a junior art history major at Colorado College, I have to say that I'm absolutely in love. Squeezing through historic doorways, I hear the occasional little child say, "Ooh, is he a senator?" And with a glance and a shake of my head, I let them know that I'm quite proudly just a Capitol Hill intern. My time as an intern for Kansas Senator Pat Roberts has been eye-opening in many ways. It has not only given me exposure to the structures and the artifacts that are key components to the founding of our country, but it has taught me how important representative democracy is to the stability of the United States. I've had the opportunity to watch John McCain, Marco Rubio, and Chuck Schumer debate the future of immigration on the Senate floor. I've spoken candidly with Senator Thune and Senator Nelson on the Senate subway. I've gotten to run bills to the Senate floor, and I've listened to an assortment of speakers, including Steve Forbes, Senator Ted Cruz, and General Martin Dempsey, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And now I give my own tours of the Capitol, sharing my passion for art and architecture with the citizens of Kansas. I convey to the constituents the importance of Trumbull's exploration paintings and the signing of the Declaration, two very important turning points in our nation's history. Attending the ICPIS program is the perfect complement to my time in the Senator's office. I see the free market values that Senator Boudreau nailed into our heads in practice when I talk to Senator Roberts about financial regulation, banking, and our dwindling personal freedoms. TFAS teaches students to look at the economy, and on a greater scale, the world, in a way that many college campuses tend to avoid altogether. Our professors encourage us to think freely and to exemplify the principles of liberty, free enterprise, and individual responsibility. I'm currently taking a class with Professor Krennewitter, who is a noted constitutional scholar and a fellow at the Claremont Institute, and I'm truly looking forward to learning about the foundations of our political system from someone with so much knowledge and expertise. I quite value spending time with similarly interested individuals. It's been invaluable at TFAS to have conversations that debate both sides of the issues. These discussions constantly expand my knowledge of free trade principles, individual rights, and capitalism. This one thing is certain, though. We are all united in the youthful goal of bettering our country and improving our future. And as much as I enjoy time with these new friends, I also appreciate my time alone in the city in sort of artistic exploration. The National Gallery, the National Building Museum, and the Sackler and Freer galleries have been my second homes on the weekend. In addition, I've been awed by the monuments and the war memorials, where artists have commemorated the most tragic and the most celebrated events in our nation's history. I'd like to thank the Fund for American Studies for this unparalleled opportunity to live and intern in the nation's capital. As I watched the fireworks over the mall and gazed over the waves of people this past 4th of July, I became deeply reflective. I am particularly grateful for the part of the program which pushes students to think freely and uphold the ideals of a democracy while allowing them to become completely immersed in art, ideology, and the political process that is uniquely America. It has been an honor to spend the summer working amongst individuals who ardently strive to protect the brilliant legacy left to us by our forefathers. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Joe Stars, Director of U.S. Summer Programs here at the Fund for American Studies. It's my honor this evening to introduce Dr. Lee Edwards. Dr. Edwards is a distinguished fellow in conservative thought in the B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles and Politics at the Heritage Foundation. A leading historian of American conservatism, Dr. Edwards is the author or editor of over 20 books, including biographies of Ronald Reagan, Barry Goldwater, and Edwin Meese. He also wrote the biography, Missionary for Freedom, The Life and Times of Walter Judd, a man you'll be hearing a lot about tonight. One of Dr. Edwards' greatest work is not literary, actually, but is bronze. Dr. Edwards was the driving force behind the establishment for the Victims of Communism Memorial, which was dedicated in 2007. The memorial, which honors the memory of over 100 million victims of communism, features a bronze copy of the Goddess of Democracy statue that was created by the student activists in China in Tiananmen Square. And by the way, if you haven't seen it, it's a very moving memorial. It's right behind near Union Station at New Jersey Avenue and Massachusetts Avenue. In 2009, Dr. Edward launched the online Global Museum on Communism. Dr. Edwards is the adjunct professor at Catholic University of America and a fellow at the Institute of Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He was the founding director of the Institute on Political Journalism at TFAS and is a member of our Board of Regents. He appears frequently on cable and broadcast outlets, Fox News, CNN, Bloomberg, NBC, to name a few. Was published in the Wall Street Journal, LA Times, Boston Globe, and too many other publications to mention. He earned a doctorate from Catholic University of America and a Bachelor of Arts in English from Duke University. And he received an honorary doctoral degree in Humane Letters from Grove City College. 5 years ago this summer, Dr. Edwards was the recipient of the Walter Judd Freedom Award. In the words of one of his colleagues, quote, "Dr. Edwards is a powerful voice for the oppressed, a noted historian, and a perfect gentleman if there ever was one. A man who seeks to save future generations from oppression by honoring those who have stood in the face of it." Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Lee Edwards.
Well, thank you, Joe. That's much too kind, much too generous. But because of what I've been associated with, and that is this cause of anti-communism, I'm pleased and honored to accept it. Reference is made to the fact that I've written a biography of Walter Judd. Here, picture of him, and I titled it "Missionary for Freedom," because Dr. Judd saw it in his lifelong mission to preserve and protect freedom and to oppose tyranny in all its forms, especially the most deadly ism of the 20th century, communism. Well, Dr. Judd personally experienced communism as a medical missionary in China during the 1920s and the 1930s, and he later challenged it as a member of Congress at the height of the Cold War, supporting our policy of containment. He was the first public figure, I believe, to compare communism with cancer, saying it was not a disease that could be controlled, but something that had to be excised from the body politic. He was also a personal witness of the total war that the Chinese communists waged in their civil war against the nationalist Chinese. In 1930, he was doing missionary work in Fujian province in southern China, where he saw how communists tried to convert a town or area to communism. First, they would burn down the town hall, destroying, if possible, all records, property titles, and so forth, trying to efface the past. Secondly, they shot, without argument, all members of the anti-communist Kuomintang party. Third, they would burn or make unfit for occupation all foreign property, residences, schools, hospitals, like the one directed by Dr. Judd, and would hold foreigners for ransom. Fourth, they would slaughter all Chinese, what they called capitalists, distributing their belongings among the common people. These capitalists, of course, were small farmers who had perhaps a half acre of land in which they grew their rice. But in the minds of the communists, they were capitalists because they had what? Private property. Not even China's lawless bandits, Dr. Judd reflected, visited such death and destruction on the people. Even if he had not read Marx's The Communist Manifesto, which denounces God and individual freedom, Dr. Judd would have been an anti-communist. Throughout his 90-some years, Dr. Judd worked with many effective anti-communists here and around the world, including the late Ambassador Lev E. Dobriansky, who in 1959 conceived the idea of a National Captive Nations Week. Every U.S. president since then, from Eisenhower to Obama, whether they are Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, has issued a proclamation designating the third week of July Captive Nations Week. Tonight, we are at the beginning of Captive Nations Week 2013. I would be remiss if I did not pause for a second and recognize the widow of Professor Ambassador Dobriansky, Julia Dobriansky. Dr. Judd was the inspiration for us when we formed the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which built the first memorial in Washington and still the only memorial in all of the world which recognizes all the victims of communism. We've now begun a capital campaign to construct a bricks-and-mortar international museum on communism here in the nation's capital. I know that if Dr. Judd were with us, he would applaud the selection of our honoree this evening, Paula Dobriansky, who throughout her life and career has been a resolute opponent of totalitarianism and an eloquent champion of the freedom and independence of all captive nations and peoples. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Randy Teague, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Fund for American Studies, as is noted in your program. When the selection committee for this award chose Paula Dobriansky to be the recipient this year, I asked Roger Ream, our president, who's on his way back, I believe, from China tonight, if he would let me participate in the introduction of Paula. Other than her mother, I am perhaps the one in the room tonight that has known her the longest time. I don't know whether it was when she was in middle school or high school, but knowing her father, who helped bring together the Fund for American Studies' very first institute at Georgetown University between 1967 and 1970 as the head of its Department of Economics, it was always a pleasure for me to see this young lady's march through an absolutely remarkable career. I think that you have been in Washington long enough during this institute this year, be it 4 or 5 weeks at this point, to know that there are some dividing lines in Washington, and there are the obvious dividing lines. There's the Republican and Democratic dividing line, the House, the Senate, Republican, Democrat, whatever it might be. But one of the dividing lines in Washington is that if you are asked to do something and you do not do it very well, it's probably unlikely that those further up the pyramid within your organization are going to ask you to do something else that's important. And whether you've had an opportunity to read in the program tonight the biographical sketch of Paula Dobriansky, or whether you will read that tonight when you return to your room or over the weekend, it is such a living testament of our hope and expectation for each one of you. It is a remarkable career that has been full of significant responsibilities, and it is a career that is full of absolutely astounding at times accomplishments in the fulfillment of her jobs. She's the, I believe, longest serving Under Secretary of State in the history of the United States. And you're not in a position of that responsibility for 8 years in the Department of State unless you are doing your job very well. And it absolutely never ceased to amaze me as I would learn of the accretion of responsibilities to her job description as to how dependent the secretaries of state that she served were on her to undertake significant responsibilities and to deliver them very well. And it was, I think, the specific incident of when she was asked to take the intractable issue of peace in Northern Ireland and deal with that subject that I said to myself, oh my God Almighty, she really is taking on the impossible task, but she has done them. She has been such a living testament to all of us that have known her about what this town can give you as the petri dish in which you do your own personal life experiences of achievement. And that is what we hope those of you here this evening will look upon this award ceremony as a representation of. Whether you are from the United States or you are from one of the many other countries that are participating in our programs this summer, you have interest in national service, in public service. You may have interest in foreign service, but it gives you such a representation, such an example of achievement to have Paula Dobriansky as the recipient of this award this evening. Thank you very much. Should I introduce Bud? Yep, it was my privilege to introduce to you a former national security advisor to the President of the United States, a man of significant achievement himself, now that we're talking about achievements, both in his military career, in his civilian service to the government of the United States, and something that is very, very important, and we fail to recognize this, I think, significantly, as we should, in his post-government service, what he has continued through his activities to represent and to achieve as he advises, thinks through, studies, counsels those in and out of government as to the foreign and defense policies of the United States. Dr. McFarlane.
Thanks very much, Randy. Thanks to each of you for coming tonight. Coming to honor a close friend of mine, but one of our most distinguished public servants, whom I've had the very good fortune, indeed the blessing, to know for more than 30 years. I had the good fortune to work with Paula when she first came to work for President Reagan. 30 years ago, she was 12 then, but seriously. You know, one doesn't rise to be appointed to be a key analyst of Soviet affairs during the Cold War by accident. Indeed, in Paula's case, she had earned that from her brilliance as a student and a graduate student. But in truth, her mother and her father established the foundation of knowledge, of history, of ideologies, of diplomacy, and over time, with that very, very solid family foundation. Paula added her own credentials at Georgetown, ultimately at Harvard. That was kind of on time on the dark side, but otherwise, she came back to a career of phenomenal distinction at the Department of State. We tend in our treatment of the Cold War to believe that it ended in an inexorable victory over an alien ideology, communism. That's not really true. Inevitable if one thinks in generations, possibly. But there was a time in the 1970s in our country where even our own government had become captive to the notion that we in America might not have the stuff the resilience, the determination to compete successfully against communism. At the time, there was a title, a description of a policy known as détente, which essentially meant that these two giant superpowers would each respect the interests of the other. And yet those who framed that policy on the U.S. side did so with a pessimism reminiscent of those in Europe, Oswald Spengler, for one, who doubted the ability of this democracy or any democracy, which over time becomes content to rely on the government for its well-being instead of the individual through freedom and the free market. And so in the 1970s, as our own economy went into decline, this policy of détente, in which rules were supposed to limit the expanse of the Soviet Union, with pledges in 1972 that they would not seek to expand their influence at the expense of the United States, we saw what happened. And instead, in the last half of that decade, if you recall, we saw the Soviet Union establish a prevailing influence. Angola, Ethiopia, South Yemen, Mozambique, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and that inexorable press, all in blatant violation of this notion of détente, did indeed call into question the resilience of the United States, the ability of our leaders to deter conflict, surely, but to compete successfully in this competition of ideas. By the end of the 1970s, there was evidence all over that we couldn't even solve our own problems here at home. Double-digit inflation, interest rates, unemployment, and people beginning to question in the pages of leading newspapers whether the presidency was simply too big for one person. Then we had an election. And we elected to office a man who believed devoutly in freedom, and that the power of freedom would enable us to compete successfully with anyone, anywhere, any ideology, at any time. And he went about first solving our own problems, restoring our own economy. But that foundation of strength and of renewal was all intended to lay a foundation in which to engage, yes, engage with the Soviet Union and demonstrate the strength, the resilience, the superiority of freedom and democracy. President Reagan was a great man, but he had no illusions that he could do this by himself. And he needed a team of people with solid foundations and an understanding of the history and the vulnerabilities of the Soviet Union, of their weaknesses. And then the content of an American strategy that would enable us to rally our own strengths, to exploit the vulnerabilities of the Soviet Union, and to engage in negotiations on an agenda where we set the terms and integrated our strength, our resources, human and natural and military, into an effective strategy to bring down Soviet Union. And he had the very, very good fortune to appoint Paula Dobriansky to be an analyst in Soviet affairs, to advise him on what to do. And this was not a job to react simply to today's events or outrages perpetrated by Moscow, but to think ahead, to think very hard about what are our goals here, what are our interests. And it was Paula, with others, Jack Matlock, colleagues at State, CIA, and Defense, who defined a four-part agenda to engage the Soviet Union on human rights, arms control, to eliminate this giant imbalance between the Soviets and us, on regional disagreements over their subversion of all of those countries I mentioned a moment ago, and finally on a bilateral agenda. Yes, trade, civil rights, but in all of these areas, to provide to the President of the United States counsel on how to use the strength of our country at the negotiating table to achieve formal agreements, treaties that would last into the future. It's fair to say that Paula, nor I, nor President Reagan anticipated that it would succeed as quickly as it did. And yet, the turnaround in the spirit, the self-confidence of Americans in the space of that 8-year period, from a time of depression, economic collapse, high unemployment, doubt, to a time of confidence, victory, renewal, and leadership in the world. I can't tell you what a blessing it was to work with Paula, nor what an honor it is to stand in her shadow tonight. I commend you, commend the Fund for American Studies. I identify, going back a long way, Walter Judd was a friend of my dad, a member of Congress also. I was a big fan of Walter Judd. It's the kind of principled conviction and knowledge about alien ideologies, notably communism, in which Paula is very, very soundly rooted. We've been blessed with her service and a distinguished career in government, and she honors your institution and the fund. I'm deeply privileged to join in presenting the Walter Judd Freedom Award 2013 to Ambassador Paula Dobriansky.
Well, good evening, everyone. And first, let me say what an honor and privilege it is to be a recipient of the Walter Judd Freedom Award. I really am very, very, very moved by the fact that the Fund for American Studies had selected me for this honor this evening. And I do want to first say to Bud McFarlane, let me start and say thank you very much for your very moving words, your passion, your intellect, your integrity. I was very fortunate, by the way, to all of the students here in the room, of having a terrific mentor in Bud McFarlane. I did work at the National Security Council. I wasn't exactly 12, but I was early on in my career. And I was very fortunate to have a boss like you who really provided the moral guidance, the incentive, and motivation. And so I'm very deeply honored that you took the time to come this evening and to present this to me. So thank you very much for being here. I also want to recognize Lee Edwards. And I do want to, especially in a number of contexts, first because it is very special, the fact that Lee Edwards wrote the definitive biography on Walter Judd. But you know, there's another special connection about the two of us. And I'm not going to say that yet my father and mother, but actually, when Lee Edwards was presented with the Walter Judd Freedom Award in July of 2008, I happened to be the introducer. And so in preparation for tonight, I actually looked back at what I had said about not only Lee, but also about Walter Judd. And I'm going to share a few of those insights in a moment. But let me also add, thank you, Lee, and I'm going to get to Randy in a moment, but thank you for both of you, your very kind words about my parents. Ambassador Dr. Lev Dobriansky and my mother, who's here this evening, Julia Dobriansky, certainly in my life have played a very important role and part. And Bud, you're quite right. Both of my parents did provide a strong moral foundation in my life. And it's that moral foundation that had impacted me in just about everything that I did, whether it was in my professional career, whether it was in volunteerism, or in so many different ways. But I want to thank both my mom and my dad for literally their contribution. So I want to thank you again, Mom. Let's give her a round. And Randy, yes, Randy, I think does know me from my teenage years and seeing me grow up. It is quite true. I've had the privilege of traveling, in fact, to a number of communist countries, actually, with Randy Teague, including then the Soviet Union when we were involved with the American Council of Young Political Leaders. And I have to say that experiences like that certainly did also provide us with a great deal of insight as to maybe some of the best ways of impacting and influencing those who were oppressed by such totalitarianism, by such ideology, but also what we were part of was actually getting in and actually trying to engage those, influence, impact their minds, have an exchange. And in that sense, we were certainly great partners. And by the way, Randy also happened to be a student of my dad's at Georgetown University. So we do go way, way, way back. I have to also add here that it really is an honor and a privilege to receive the Walter Judd Freedom Award. It's an exceptional honor that has, over the last decades, been conferred on some extraordinary Americans for their contributions to the advancement of liberty. As was mentioned, there are 4 here tonight: General Rowney, Lee Edwards, Suzanne Schulte, and Otto Reich. I also do want to mention that others, like President Reagan, who Bud spoke so eloquently about, Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick. I've also had the honor to work with Dr. Harry Wu, as have a number of others of dear friends I see in this audience. And there were others, too many maybe for me to take the time to announce here. But I do want to say that there's one common thread that unites each and every one of us, and that is the stories of past recipients are bound by a common thread of service to principle, that human liberty is an absolute right, and that it is America's responsibility to inspire and to foster efforts to realize it. And this principle is enshrined not only in our founding values, but in our own national experience. And toward that end, I can't tell you that it just, when I think about it, that all of these individuals, that we have such a common tie, which is of great significance and great impact on the lives of others across the globe in support of human freedom. I want to begin with a quote in looking at Walter Judd, a quote that probably to you will be an unusual one that I picked, and that is of Napoleon Bonaparte. He had a quote in saying, quote, "There are two powers in the world, the sword and the mind. In the long run, the sword is always beaten by the mind." Well, to me, Napoleon Bonaparte's quote is rather fitting when I think about Walter Judd. And the reason why is because the power of ideas is all about Walter Judd. The power of ideas overtake the power of the sword. And that was one of the missions of Walter Judd. Toward this end, one of many examples that I could give, but I'm going to give one in this case, is cited in the book written by Lee Edwards, and that is the case that Walter Judd had taken on in Congress in support of the Voice of America. The Voice of America was being debated in Congress, as it has a number of times, and about its broadcasts, and whether or not there should be an appropriation to the Voice of America, which a number of you, well, when I look around this audience, I'm thinking, I hope you know the Voice of America. The Voice of America is a broadcast instrument that does go into the captive nations and shares American ideas and values, and also discusses on the ground dissidents and opposition and developments that also people can learn about. Now, right now, we know that there is social media and there are so many different ways of getting information. But going back to Walter Judd and the Voice of America, what he said at the time, and this was the quote, he said, "The future of the nation and the world," he stated, "depended upon the spread of the ideas of the American Constitution and government. That, in my judgment, is the only way we can ultimately turn back the tide of totalitarianism and tyranny, which is sweeping over the earth." Well, guess what? With his fortitude, with his conviction, and with his resolute determination to get that through, the appropriation was granted. And we all know about the Voice of America and still the role that it does play. I know that it wasn't really too long ago when I was actually visiting China. And I remember hearing, actually, that there were many, including leaders, who listened to the Voice of America. And mind you, as I look out at this audience, even in the midst of social media, which I'm sure is uppermost in your minds. But let me come to a second example, a remarkable example about Walter Judd. Not only was he someone who really was all about the power of ideas, but he was also well before his time, in my opinion. And that was on an issue which is in such great debate today, and that's the issue of foreign aid and assistance. Walter Judd was a leader in this area. It was truly remarkable. Here, again, in Lee's biography, I want to share with you what he said, which to me goes to just the essence of the importance of foreign assistance, which at times our own Congress has debated, and many have questioned, do we really want to be providing under 1% of our appropriations to foreign assistance? Walter Judd said, "What we are trying to do in this program is to safeguard the security of the United States, period. That means we are striving to build a world of peace and freedom. Otherwise, we will not long be secure. That means we have to stand with all others who are striving for the same kind of a world. The primary purpose of foreign aid was not to buy friends, as critics charged, but to help free peoples on their own feet so that they can maintain their independence and keep their land and resources out of the hands of our enemies." It was stated how Walter Judd used a lot of analogies and often referred to his own medical experience. And by the way, in this case, he did. He talked about how foreign aid was comparable to a country needing an operation, the operation of an ill patient who has not yet completely recovered. And he basically said, if you look at was an operation the failure, no, look at it the alternative. And here, without it, the individual without that assistance could have ended up in the cemetery. And with it, he is alive and functioning, and at least he has a better chance of getting on his feet and moving forward. So that's the second piece that I want to share with you about Walter Judd that I personally identify with, not only the power of ideas, but also the importance of foreign assistance. As I said, less than 1% of our budget goes to foreign assistance. And it's interesting to me, in many of our elections, there's quite a debate about this, about whether or not we should still keep supporting it, whether it really matters. My vote is Walter Judd was right then, and it's very applicable to circumstances now. Two other things I'd like to identify. Walter Judd came up with the idea of a Freedom Academy at the State Department. He was looking at, the State Department has a Foreign Service Institute. And my reason for sharing this with you is because, interestingly enough, there is another individual who is a dear friend of mine, Mark Palmer, Ambassador Mark Palmer, who happened to be ambassador to Hungary, and in the Reagan administration, he happened to be a counterpart at the State Department as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Soviet Affairs. Mark Palmer criticized the Foreign Service Institute, and you know why? Because they were giving the Foreign Service officers theoretical discussions about foreign policy. And he said, enough of these theoretical ideas. Why don't we have practical, on-the-ground experience for our Foreign Service officers? By the way, Mark Palmer did get in a bit of trouble, and the reason why was because, as ambassador, he marched with the dissidents in the street, actually in downtown Budapest. And that's the message that he wanted to impart to other Foreign Service institutes about the power that you have in understanding situations on the ground, live situations, and you're being part of it, versus just theories. So, again, Walter Judd, really ahead of his times. He already knew, by setting up a Freedom Academy, that the practical experience could really make a difference in the lives of so many of our diplomats. Finally, I'll come to the point of just freedom itself, the value and the importance of freedom. Here, I will say that when you look at the words and deeds of men like Judd, Walter Judd, and Ronald Reagan, it's very important that their words be remembered by the new generations, by the rising generations, by all of you, by documenting the crimes of communism, by working tirelessly to get this information out, whether it's through literature, whether it's through blogs, through memorials like the Victims of Communism Memorial. So all will never forget the kinds of crimes that will never be forgotten. An individual like Congressman Walter Judd has kept us vigilant, and vigilant in safeguarding against a repeat of the terrible events of the past. These were words that I used in my remarks when I introduced Lee Edwards. And you know, I said, in its own way, history smiles on those who commit themselves to carrying for a time the torch of liberty in that relay which is America's mission. Interestingly enough, Walter Judd, by the way, lived to see the collapse of the Soviet Union. But by the way, we also know that that story is still ongoing. I'd like to say that we've witnessed solid freedom there, justice and prosperity, and quite candidly, we have not in that case. If freedom's march is to continue, we must learn our history well and apply wisely its lessons. In conclusion, let me quote Alexis de Tocqueville. He said, "History is a gallery of pictures in which there are few originals and many copies." In my book, Walter Judd is definitively an original. And for me, that's why I have to say I feel very privileged, very proud to be part of the extraordinary group of individuals that have been honored by this award. Thank you very much, and let me say I would be delighted to take a few questions, comments as you may have. Thank you so much. Questions, comments? I know the students, you must have some from your experiences. Who's going to step forward?
Would you have ever thought that 1989 would have unfolded the way that it did?
Well, would I ever have thought, the question I'm sure, I hope you all heard, would 1989 have unfolded the way it did? Well, you might be surprised by my answer to that question. My answer is, in some ways, yes. And you want to know why? Because of my father. And the reason why is because my father instilled in me a belief that freedom is universal, and that no matter what you may be bound by and how you may be repressed, that will pass. It may take decades, it may take a virtual lifetime, but it will change. And in that sense, Randy, I will say, I felt it would come. I didn't think it was necessarily going to come in the context in which it did, which was interesting with Gorbachev, and Gorbachev putting forward a glasnost at the time. And some have speculated that what he put forward, he didn't anticipate the events would unfold the way they did. But I would say that I've always believed in what my father instilled in me, and that is, as I said, that people everywhere have a desire for freedom. And even though they might be in chains, and I don't mean literal chains, but I mean in terms of literally being chained, not having the basic fundamental freedoms that we have in our lives, that they will prevail. Suzanne Schulte, I think here, has worked tirelessly on behalf of those in North Korea. And I'm optimistic that it will come at a point when that will change. So yes, but that's because, as I said, of my father's strong belief that the Soviet Union would crumble and we would see the kinds of changes that we did. The sad part about that story is some of the countries got off the ground well, and as we know, some others have not. And the story still remains. Yes, and do you mind identifying yourself?
Yes, my name is Haysam Hussain. I'm an Egyptian.
Okay.
So I really enjoyed your talk today. So my
Do
question.
you mind introducing yourself again so everyone can hear who you are? Thank you.
My name is Haysam Hussain. I'm a native Egyptian. I live in Pennsylvania, and I attend Lebanon Valley College. So my question is, you talked a lot about freedom, spreading freedom in the Soviet Union, and you just mentioned North Korea. So what are your thoughts and observations about what's happening nowadays in the Middle East, most likely in Egypt and Syria?
Well, I'll first start with Egypt because you are Egyptian. One, there was actually an op-ed in the Washington Post today by Fred Hyatt excuse me, I take that back. His was on Russia. There was a couple of days ago, it was on Egypt and what is playing out in Egypt. Personally, I'm very gratified by what we're witnessing. And the reason why? Because the people are speaking. They have spoken in terms of their desire for basic freedom. And what we have witnessed under the Morsi regime, as well as the kinds of policies that were being pursued, were bit by bit undermining freedoms, basic freedoms. So from that standpoint, the reason why I'm gratified is I think those messages of those that are out in the streets are being taken note of by many throughout the Middle East. That kind of grassroots populism and advancement of democracy in the long run, I think can, I hope, be the foundation for a more sustainable, institutionalized foundation for democracy going forward. I mentioned foreign assistance, by the way, and interestingly enough, the piece that was in the Post basically argued against actually continuation of foreign assistance. There was an editorial, and then there was also an op-ed written by Senators McCain and Graham, in which they said this would be a time to cut assistance because of the need to support what's happening on the ground and the need for genuine change in Egypt. With regard to Syria, I'm going to actually quote someone whose op-ed actually stood out in my mind, someone who identified him as a liberal and not a hawk, and that is Nicholas Kristof, who writes for the New York Times. I will never forget his op-ed last year, which is so true for this year and this time. And what it was, he basically wrote that he was embarrassed and ashamed that the United States was just sitting on the sidelines while what was playing out in Syria. That we needed to be engaged, first and foremost, just basically in a humanitarian context, because of the lives being lost. Now the number of lives being lost are over some 100,000. And then secondly, in terms of also the political situation playing out, the removal of Assad. And thirdly, and most significantly, the vacuum that's being created by the lack of American leadership on the ground. He was not advocating putting American boots on the ground, and that's not what I'm advocating to you today. But there are ways of going forward and providing the kind of assistance and support that will enable those who want to bring about democracy and change and are empowered to do it. So from that standpoint, my view is, I think in both contexts, these are critical developments. Egypt, for sure, many in the Middle East look to what's happening in Egypt, and the situation in Syria, just even starting, as I said, basically with the humanitarian situation, is really just very deplorable. So those are my views. I can only hope that we step forward and do the right things in both of these cases. I think there are a couple of other hands. Yes, please. Go ahead, and then we'll go over there.
Yes, my name's Landon. I'm from Texas. And as I'm sure you know, there's currently a coalition of left-leaning states in the Western Hemisphere, including Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, also known as ALBA. And it's been in the news a lot recently because of a lot of those countries' offers to Edward Snowden of asylum. So I guess my question to you is, in your opinion, does this coalition of left-leaning states, does it represent any sort of threat to U.S. security or U.S. interests?
Well, I'll make 2 points on this, and I hope all of you heard the question with regard to the ALBA coalition of particularly the Andean countries, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, in Latin America. Does this pose a threat to the United States? I have sort of 2 responses on this. The first is, I think the greatest threat that is out there, and in which there has been a call for hearings on, is actually the involvement of countries like Iran. There have been a number of reports about Iran's engagement in Venezuela and in some of these countries. I think that these kinds of allegations or views that are put out there, there needs to be information that is put on the table and looked at. There have been other also concerns about various terrorist groups that have also been finding harbor in a number of countries in our neighborhood. So I'd start with that. Secondly, in terms of their banding together, let me flip that. And I'm going to flip it in the sense that, you know, it's interesting that a left-leaning country, you can have a left-leaning leader, but you can also have, by the way, ways in which you can find common ground to agree on. Now, by the way, I'm not suggesting that that's the answer to this situation, but I just want to give a little bit of a counter that even though they're left-leaning, that doesn't mean that you can't find common ground. And let me give you the graphic case in point. In the country of Uruguay, there have been a number of left-leaning leaders. And one happened, Vasquez, happened to be a leader a number of leaders ago. He, during the Bush administration, he's an oncologist, he actually found very common ground with President Bush and the Bush administration on, interestingly enough, issues of free trade and the importance of economic and commercial ties and how that would benefit his own country. So let me make 2 points. I think that the question is this a threat? I'd be more concerned about developments rather than these 3 countries banding together. I'd be concerned about some of the other elements coming into the region and what it means and portends for us. And then secondly, because you mentioned left-leaning, I did want to put that out there, that, you know, you should look at what countries do in terms of their respect for human rights, whether they're left or right, and whether there's common ground on which to build on. In the case of Uruguay, actually, there was a respect for human rights. There was an interest in spawning commercial relationships in this regard, and actually it was a relationship that really grew. But in the case with Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, you're talking about many other issues that are problematic in terms of fundamental freedoms in this case. And you may know we don't have ambassadors in the case of, actually, I'm coming to think of it, of all 3 of those countries. Yes, back there. You have the mic.
Okay. Hi, my name is Colin Bear. I'm from California. I went to college in Texas, and I'm now coming half circle here in DC. And my question is, I guess from your perspective, having worked with him, what was Ronald Reagan really like? And do you have any memorable, funny, or interesting anecdotes from your time with him?
Absolutely. Well, you know, Bud could answer this question much better than myself because he was in the office and at Ronald Reagan's side. But I will tell you this, I thought he was an incredible person in so many ways. One, I loved his attachment to the first point I made about the power of ideas. He was very much about the power of ideas. In fact, I remember in working on a variety of human rights cases, and when Ronald Reagan gave and delivered so many, not only speeches, but what was critical, there were not speeches and good words, but there was action. The policy matched what was said. When Natan Sharansky, at that time he was Anatoly Sharansky, he was in the Soviet Gulag. When he was freed and came to first the United States before he went to Israel, I remember his words. Do you know that he said that he was motivated, inspired, and it was Ronald Reagan's words that truly kept him going in his days in the Gulag. So in that sense, I have to say Ronald Reagan was a man of vision. He was a man of fortitude. He was someone who had not only a strategic vision, but he put it in place. As I said, it wasn't only words, but also action. And then there was also a side of Ronald Reagan in his second term where I think with his relationship with Gorbachev, he also saw opportunities, and opportunities that were built on. I have two funny stories, and I will end on this note, I think. The two funny stories, the first one was during my time when it was Judge William Clark, who was the National Security Advisor. He came from the State Department. He was formerly the Deputy Secretary of State. He brought in National Security Council staff into the Oval Office. And I have to tell you, for me personally, it was very exciting. Because yes, I was younger at that time. I was in my early 20s. And the thought of, my gosh, I might be asked to come in and to brief President Reagan on a topic. So I got a phone call from him, and he said, I want you in my office. I think it was like 7 a.m. And he called me like at 6 a.m. and he said, I want you to brief on Poland. So I went to his office, meaning Judge Clark's office, and we went into the Oval Office together to see Ronald Reagan. He was in there, and at the time, I think Ed Meese was in the room, and there were several others who were in the room, and of course Judge Clark. And you know what? Ronald Reagan had an incredible sense of humor, and I was nervous. So I think he saw it. And so the first thing he said, he looks at me and he goes, you know who was here yesterday in my office? You'll never believe, Miss America. Miss America was in my office, and you know what she gave me? She gave me a fantastic business card that I'm showing everyone. So I said, Mr. President, what's that? He said, take a look at it. It says I'm Mr. Everything. And he said, but look at what it has on the back side, all of these credentials. But you know what it doesn't say about me that I know I am? I said, Mr. President, what? It doesn't say I'm sexy, sensual, and foxy. And so he was that kind of person. I mean, I could tell you so many jokes and funny things, but let me tell you the last one. The last one was when I was leaving, and it relates to my father, actually. I was leaving, and as is traditional, you go into the Oval Office to have a photograph. And so we went into the Oval Office, and my father was ambassador. He happened to be ambassador to the Bahamas. So we went in. It was my father, my sister. My mom, unfortunately, couldn't be with us at that moment. She was under the weather. So the three of us went in, and I couldn't believe it, okay? My sister and my father kind of moved over to the side, and they began some discussion. So I'm looking at President Reagan, and you know, in his style, you know, he's kind of looking like this, like, what's going on? And I'm looking like, what's going on? What are they talking about over there? They seemed like they were arguing in the Oval Office. So I'm thinking, my gosh, this is my photo. What's happening? So I didn't know what was happening. Finally, my father grabbed my sister's arm and sort of squeezed it and said, over there. So we lined up for the picture. We took our pictures. We got outside into the West Wing area on the ground, and I immediately laid into them. I said, what were you two doing? That was my, you know, my farewell photo with President Reagan, and you're fighting in the Oval Office? So my dad goes, well, you know, your sister was telling me because I'm ambassador, I had to stand here, and she was going to stand there, and so we were quibbling over where we were going to stand. I said, unbelievable. And my dad said, look, don't worry about it. We'll rectify this somehow. So I'm thinking, how is he going to rectify it? I was then doubly horrified because my dad, I believe it might have even been Captive Nations, was with President Reagan like 3 weeks later. So then my father said to me, oh, Paula, you know what? I happen to be with President Reagan. And you know what? I got to talk to him about that incident. I said, what? You talked to him about this, and what did you say? So he said, well, you know what? I said to him, oh, Mr. President, you probably wouldn't remember me, but you know, my daughter was at the National Security Council, and we were having our farewell photo, and Reagan stopped him. He said, no, I remember you. Of course I do. You're the family that was fighting in the Oval Office. So how embarrassing. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, where is this going to? So then my dad proceeded to say, well, you know, he said that, and then, but then Reagan, in true Reagan style, and this really answers your question, you know what he said? Oh, and Ambassador Dobriansky, it was so refreshing to hear you argue. It was good for me to know that there are other families that have as vicious fights as my own. So he was wonderful. I was very, very lucky, and I will tell you, when I look back, it was I got to say, one of my most fantastic jobs, one that I grew in and really learned a great deal from and had the great privilege of contributing to. So let me just say thank you all for coming tonight. I know we've spilled over. Some of you are hungry and are looking to the reception, but thank you so much for coming. I'm very appreciative.